Hello folks, J.R. Thomas at the George Ranch Historical Park, and today we are going to talk about Mr. Stephen Fuller Austin, the father of Texas. Now, Mr. Austin was born in Virginia in November of 1793. His father had been in the lead mining business. Well, in 1819, Mr. Stephen Austin, he's an adult, he moved to the Arkansas territories to a place now known as Little Rock, Arkansas. It was just northeast of where Mr. Henry Jones of the George legacy, where he lived. But he was trying to establish a town, and he ran for the local government, didn't really succeed. So he moved, Mr. Stephen Austin moved back to New Orleans, unfortunately penniless, where he met with a man and he studied law. Mr. Moses Austin secured a contract with the Spanish government to bring 300 families to colonize Texas. But unfortunately, in 1821, Mr. Stephen F. Austin's father, Moses Austin, died. And it passed on to Mr. Stephen Austin himself to take over the business enterprise. Now, why did Stephen Austin bring these 300 families? A lot of kids tell me freedom, to give them land, all kinds of answers. But the grim reality is, why did Mr. Stephen Austin bring these 300 families here? Money. In return for bringing 300 families here, Mr. Stephen Austin received 67,000 acres of land. 67,000 acres. Yeah. Catches at the end of 25 years, he either has to give away or sell 2/3 of that land. He is going to be rich beyond all imagination. Mr. Austin was very successful in bringing these 300 families here to Texas, but Mr. Austin was now basically the entire government, the civil and the military. And he spent a lot of time in the saddle addressing all the issues that these new families had here in Texas. And well, during the course of this, Mr. Austin, well, he spent quite a bit of his own money bringing in supplies, supporting the infrastructure, helping out the families. And Mr. Austin was even in support of Santa Anna when he took power. Now, in 1833, Mr. Austin went to Mexico to try to get Texas to be recognized as its own state of Mexico. But the Mexican government said, you know what, if you want to become a state, we require that area, that territory, to have 80,000 citizens. Unfortunately, well, there was only 30,000 citizens here in Texas. But then the powers that be over there in Mexico City, they thought Mr. Stephen Austin was being seditious, trying to usurp the government, trying to be rebellious. And he was thrown in jail there in 1834 and then released in 1835. When he came back to Texas after his imprisonment in 1835, well, he was no longer in support of the Mexican government and actually kind of against them, wanting to rebel. Well, Mr. Austin, because he was part of the military government, he basically was a military government, he was in charge of the Texas Army during the Revolution, but then that got turned over to Mr. Sam Houston, thus freeing Mr. Austin to tend to all these other matters that needed to be handled. And actually, Mr. Stephen Austin was in New Orleans when the Mexicans were defeated by the Texas Army there in April of 1836. Mr. Austin returned to Texas. And then, unfortunately, in December, that same year that Texas got its independence, Mr. Stephen Austin died. And if you'd like to find out where it is, he died in what is now West Columbia, Texas.